The pregnant waitress didn't know that the Mafia Boss sitting in booth 7 had been born without the ability to feel pain, couldn't have known that the accidental touch of her fingertips against the raised scar tissue on his arm would make him experience something 40 medical specialists had sworn was neurologically impossible, and definitely couldn't have predicted that the look of shock on his face would change both their lives forever. Gabriel Stone owned half the Western Territory, and the other half belonged to people who paid him for the privilege of breathing. The Chrome Valley Diner sat 3 blocks from the warehouse district, a front operation that served decent coffee and laundered better money. Tuesday's lunch crowd knew the rules without being told. Stay away from booth 7, don't make eye contact. Mind your own business and maybe you'll make it home for dinner. He sat with his back to the wall as always, watching the front entrance and the kitchen doors simultaneously. Across from him, Tommy Vasquez shifted in his seat, trying to maintain composure while negotiating terms he had no leverage to refuse. The representative from the Eastern Docks wore an expensive suit that couldn't hide the sweat gathering at his collar. Gabriel's reputation had been built on a foundation that most men couldn't comprehend. When he was 8 years old, his house caught fire in the middle of a summer afternoon. While other children screamed and cried, Gabriel walked calmly through flames to carry his baby sister to safety. His arms blistered, his skin melted, but he never made a sound. The paramedics called it shock. The doctors called it something else entirely. Congenital insensitivity to pain, a neurological condition so rare that most physicians went their entire careers without encountering a single case. Gabriel's nerve pathway simply didn't transmit pain signals the way normal bodies did. He could feel pressure, temperature, texture, but suffering? That language didn't exist in his nervous system. The doctors explained to his father that this condition would require constant vigilance. Children with this disorder often injured themselves severely because they lacked the warning system that kept normal people safe. His father heard something different. He heard opportunity. By 15, Gabriel had earned his first territory through a fistfight that should have killed him. He took hits that fractured bones, tore tissue, ruptured organs, and he kept coming. His opponent eventually collapsed from exhaustion while Gabriel stood covered in his own blood, waiting for the next round. Word spread quickly. The kid who couldn't be hurt. The fighter who wouldn't go down, the enforcer who walked through violence like other men walked through rain. Now, at 39, he controlled an empire built on that reputation. Men twice his size stepped aside when he approached. Rival organizations negotiated rather than fought, because everyone knew the same truth. You couldn't intimidate someone who didn't fear injury. You couldn't torture someone who didn't feel pain. You couldn't break someone who had never experienced the concept of breaking. Tommy cleared his throat, dragging Gabriel's attention back to the negotiation. The Eastern Docks wanted to increase their percentage on the shipping containers. A bold move considering they were sitting in Gabriel's territory, eating his food, breathing his air. Rachel Morrison tied her apron with trembling fingers in the kitchen, trying to remember the table numbers the manager had rattled off during her 10-minute orientation. First day, 8 months pregnant, feet already swelling in shoes that barely fit. She needed this job the way drowning people needed air. Desperately and without alternatives. The lunch rush hit like a tsunami, orders screamed from the kitchen. Customers flagged her down from 6 directions simultaneously. Her back ached. Her daughter kicked against her ribs with what felt like tiny feet made of knives. But Rachel kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering everything she had run from. She balanced 3 plates on her left arm, 2 in her right hand, navigating between tables with the careful deliberation of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. Booth 7 loomed in her peripheral vision like a storm cloud. The other servers had whispered warnings. Don't bother them. Don't interrupt. Definitely don't screw up. Gabriel leaned forward, his voice dropping to a register that made Tommy's hands shake. The Eastern Docks would accept the current terms, or they would find themselves dealing with someone far less reasonable than Gabriel. The choice was theirs, but they had approximately 90 seconds to make it. Rachel reached for the water pitcher, her pregnant belly throwing off her center of balance in ways she hadn't adjusted to yet. The pitcher slipped. Not much, just enough to send water cascading across the adjacent table, droplets splashing toward booth 7 like liquid shrapnel. She froze, watching water spread across laminate. Horror flooding her system with enough adrenaline to make her hands shake even harder. The man in the expensive suit stopped talking mid-sentence. The other man, the one with eyes like winter storms, turned his head slowly to assess the situation. Rachel grabbed napkins, her voice tumbling out in breathless apology. So sorry, brand new, didn't mean to disturb, would clean it immediately. Please, so sorry. Gabriel's gaze swept over her with the emotional investment of someone examining furniture. Pregnant. nervous, irrelevant. He dismissed her with a gesture that said more than words ever could. Handle it quietly and disappear. She nodded frantically, soaking up water while trying to remain invisible. The conversation resumed as if she had never existed. Tommy accepted Gabriel's terms with a voice that cracked on the final words. Smart man. The meeting concluded with handshakes that looked cordial and felt like death sentences wrapped in civility. Gabriel stood, buttoning his suit jacket with mechanical precision. Tommy practically ran for the exit, probably already planning how to explain the new arrangement to his bosses. Gabriel collected his phone from the table, checking messages that would determine someone's fate before sunset. Rachel appeared beside booth 7 with a plastic bin ready to clear the abandoned coffee cups and untouched water glasses. She worked quickly, efficiently, trying to erase evidence of the meeting before anyone could comment on her earlier mistake. Her daughter kicked again, a reminder of why she endured jobs that paid minimum wage and demanded maximum dignity. She reached across the table for the final glass, her swollen belly pressing against the booth's edge. Her hand stretched toward the far corner where Gabriel's coffee cup sat next to scattered napkins. He shifted at the same moment, his scarred forearm coming to rest exactly where her fingers descended. Contact lasted less than a second. Her fingertips brushed the raised scar tissue that ran from his wrist to his elbow, a souvenir from a knife fight 3 years earlier that had required 47 stitches and 0 anesthesia. The sensation hit Gabriel like electricity through water. Every nerve ending in his arm ignited simultaneously, transmitting signals his brain had never been designed to process. Not just pressure or temperature, but actual feeling, texture, warmth. The electric current of human touch travelling through pathways that had been silent for 39 years. His phone clattered against the table. His other hand shot out, gripping the booth's edge hard enough that the wood frame groaned under the pressure. His face drained of colour, grey eyes going wide with something that looked like terror and wonder fighting for dominance. Rachel jumped backwards, certain she had done something catastrophically wrong. The man looked like he was having a medical emergency, heart attack maybe. Stroke, something terrible that would get her fired on her first day while also traumatizing her for life. Gabriel couldn't speak, couldn't move. His entire existence had narrowed to the spot on his arm where her fingers had touched him. The sensation lingered like an echo, nerve ending still firing even though contact had broken. For the first time since birth, his body had communicated pain, pleasure, feeling, something beyond the baseline numbness he had accepted as permanent. His breathing came in sharp gasps that filled his chest with air he could suddenly feel moving through his lungs in entirely new ways. The scar on his arm, the one that had been nothing more than raised tissue and visual reminder, now carried memory of her touch, like brand marks carried heat. Rachel stammered another apology, backing away from whatever she had triggered. Gabriel's gaze locked onto her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Not anger exactly. Something deeper, more desperate. That touch would cost her everything she was trying to protect. But standing in that diner during the lunch rush, neither of them understood yet what impossible door had just opened between them. And in that impossible moment, every doctor who had ever examined me became a liar. If this opening hooked you, you know what to do. Also, don't forget to comment the country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Gabriel remained motionless in booth 7, his hand pressed against the scarred forearm where her fingers had made contact. The lunch crowd moved around him in oblivious chaos, unaware that the most dangerous man in 3 counties had just experienced something that rewrote everything he understood about his own body. The house fire happened on a July afternoon when Gabriel was 7 years old. Faulty wiring in the basement, flames spreading faster than anyone predicted. His mother screamed from the front lawn, neighbours calling emergency services while thick smoke poured from second-story windows. Gabriel's baby sister was inside, trapped in a nursery that had become an oven. He walked through the front door while firefighters were still 3 minutes away. Flames consumed the staircase, turning wood into charcoal beneath his feet. His skin blistered on contact with superheated air. His lungs filled with smoke that should have sent him to his knees. But pain never arrived to warn him of danger, never screamed at him to stop, never convinced his body that survival meant retreat. Gabriel found his sister in her crib, pulled her against his chest, and carried her back through fire that melted the synthetic fabric of his shirt directly onto his skin. When paramedics arrived, they found a 7-year-old boy standing on the front lawn holding a screaming infant, his arms covered in third-degree burns that had already begun weeping clear fluid. He wasn't crying, wasn't even wincing, just standing there like he'd walked through a mild inconvenience instead of an inferno. The emergency room doctors ran every test available. Neurologists poked him with needles, applied pressure to injury sites, used instruments designed to trigger reflexes that simply didn't exist in his nervous system. The diagnosis came back definitive: congenital insensitivity to pain, permanent, incurable, a condition that turned the body's most basic warning system into silent static. His father absorbed this information with an expression Gabriel would later recognize as calculation. Where doctors saw disability requiring constant supervision, his father saw potential that could be weaponized. At 15, Gabriel got jumped by 4 older boys outside a convenience store in the East District. They wanted his jacket, his wallet, his dignity. What they got was a demonstration of what happened when someone fought without the biological imperative to protect themselves from damage. Gabriel took hits that shattered his cheekbone, cracked 3 ribs, split his lip in ways that would require reconstructive surgery, and he kept coming. The other boys eventually scattered, leaving Gabriel standing in a parking lot covered in blood that belonged entirely to his own body. Word spread through the neighborhood like infection: the kid who wouldn't go down, the fighter who didn't feel it. His father used that reputation like currency, introducing Gabriel to people who valued violence the way businessmen valued contracts. By 21, Gabriel had earned his invitation to the organization through an initiation that broke most candidates before completion. 3 senior members took him to a warehouse and spent 6 hours testing his commitment with methods designed to extract confessions from hardened criminals. They burned him with cigarettes, dislocated his shoulder, applied pressure to nerve clusters that made grown men beg for mercy. Gabriel sat through all of it with the emotional response of someone enduring a tedious meeting. When they finally stopped, convinced they were dealing with something inhuman, he stood up and asked what came next. At 26, Gabriel made his move on the previous territory boss. The older man controlled the Western District through a combination of strategic violence and generational connections. Gabriel challenged him directly, publicly, in a way that demanded immediate response. The fight happened in a warehouse full of witnesses, both sides present to ensure the outcome would be honored. The boss shot Gabriel 3 times. Center mass. Proper placement. Wounds that should have dropped any normal person into shock and unconsciousness. Gabriel felt the impact, felt bullets tearing through tissue and muscle, but pain never arrived to shut down his system. He closed the distance between them while blood soaked through his shirt, and he finished the fight with his bare hands. 3 bullets required 3 separate surgeries. Doctors expressed amazement that he survived, that he remained conscious, that he walked into the emergency room under his own power. Gabriel's reputation crystallized in those moments. The man who couldn't be hurt, the enforcer who wouldn't stop, the successor who had earned his position through a demonstration no one could dispute. But the condition that built his empire also demanded constant vigilance. Gabriel learned to visually inspect himself multiple times daily, checking for injuries his body wouldn't report. He set timers to remind himself to eat, because hunger became easy to ignore. He once walked on a broken ankle for 11 days before noticing the swelling. The tip of his left pinky finger rotted from infection before he realized something had gone wrong, requiring amputation of everything below the second knuckle. Medical specialists examined him throughout his life, each consultation ending with the same conclusion. Dr. Brennan had been the most thorough, conducting extensive neurological testing when Gabriel turned 32. The doctor spent 3 months mapping his nerve pathways, applying stimuli, measuring responses that consistently showed the same results. No pain signals transmitted. No pathway existed for suffering to travel from injury site to conscious awareness. Dr. Brennan had been absolutely certain in his final assessment. The condition was congenital, meaning Gabriel had been born this way. More importantly, it was permanent. No treatment existed. No therapy could restore what had never functioned properly in the first place. His nerve pathways simply didn't transmit pain signals, and medical science had no mechanism to change that fundamental reality. Gabriel had accepted this verdict the same way he accepted breathing, an unchangeable fact of existence, a limitation that shaped every choice, every relationship, every moment of his life, until a pregnant waitress touched his arm during lunch service. Now Gabriel sat in booth 7 with his hand pressed against scarred tissue that still carried ghost sensations of her fingertips. Everything Dr. Brennan had said with such certainty suddenly felt like lies wrapped in professional authority. Every specialist who had confirmed the diagnosis now seemed complicit in maintaining a deception Gabriel couldn't yet fully comprehend. Because if she could make him feel with a simple touch, then someone had been wrong about his condition for 39 years. Or worse, someone had been lying. Rachel Morrison's feet had stopped belonging to her somewhere around hour 3 of her shift. They existed now as distant objects at the end of her legs, swollen and screaming protests she couldn't afford to acknowledge. 8 months pregnant. 2 double shifts this week already. Rent due in 6 days. Her daughter needed her to survive this, so survival became the only option that mattered. The Chrome Valley Diner had hired her because they were desperate, and desperation recognized its own kind. The manager had glanced at her belly, asked if she could work through discomfort, and put her on the schedule before her references even cleared. Questions about insurance and maternity leave had been met with vague promises that Rachel knew would evaporate the moment she needed them, but the job paid weekly, in cash, and required no background checks that might connect her to the life she had escaped. 2 months ago she had been someone else entirely, a girl with a family who loved her conditionally, and a boyfriend who loved her until the pregnancy test came back positive. He had demanded she terminate. She had refused. He disappeared 3 days later, blocking her number and moving out of their apartment while she was at work. Her family delivered their verdict through her mother's voice over the phone. Keep the baby, lose us. Choose. Rachel chose her daughter. The consequence was losing everything else. She packed what fit in 2 suitcases and bought a bus ticket to a city she had never visited, chosen purely because it was far enough from home that accidental encounters became impossible. The room above the laundromat cost $400 monthly, a space so small that her twin mattress touched 3 walls simultaneously. But the landlord didn't ask questions, accepted cash, and left her alone. In her current circumstances, those qualities made it perfect. The lunch rush attacked with the intensity of coordinated violence. Orders flew from the kitchen window faster than Rachel could deliver them. Her back cramped in ways that suggested her spine was attempting escape. Her daughter kicked against her ribs with timing that felt deliberately vindictive. The other servers moved around her with the practiced efficiency of people who had memorized this chaos, leaving Rachel to navigate unfamiliar territory while pretending competence. The older waitress, a woman named Diane with 30 years of experience carved into her face, had pulled Rachel aside during the morning prep. Her warnings came wrapped in matter-of-fact delivery that made them more terrifying than shouted threats. Booth 7 belongs to the owner. Don't interrupt his meetings. Don't offer refills unless he signals. Don't make eye contact. Don't ask questions. Most importantly, don't mess up anywhere near that table because mistakes have consequences in establishments like this. Rachel had nodded understanding while her stomach twisted with the awareness that she had taken employment somewhere that operated according to rules she didn't fully comprehend. But pregnant women 3 weeks from homelessness didn't have the luxury of ethical employment standards. The water pitcher incident happened because her center of gravity had shifted in ways her muscle memory hadn't adjusted to yet. One moment she was reaching across a table, the next moment liquid was cascading toward the forbidden booth like her worst fears manifesting in physical form. The man with the expensive suit flinched. The other man, the one who owned everything including apparently her immediate future, turned his head with mechanical precision. Rachel's apologies tumbled out in breathless panic while she soaked up water with napkins that disintegrated under the volume. The owner dismissed her with a gesture, and she retreated gratefully, certain she had just survived an encounter that could have ended much worse. When she returned to clear booth 7 after the meeting concluded, her sole objective was invisibility. Collect the dishes, erase evidence, disappear before anyone remembered she existed. Her hand stretched across the table toward the final coffee cup. Her fingers made contact with his arm. The man's reaction was immediate and terrifying. His phone dropped. His face went pale. His entire body locked into rigidity that looked like the onset of catastrophic medical emergency. Rachel jumped backward, horrified that somehow her touch had triggered heart attack or stroke in the most dangerous person she had encountered since arriving in this city. She started to ask if he needed help, if she should call emergency services, if she had done something wrong. The words died when his hand shot out, catching her wrist. Not rough, not painful, but absolutely immovable. His grip carried the certainty of someone who never questioned whether his strength would be sufficient. His voice came out raw, confused, almost vulnerable in ways that seemed impossible for someone who inspired the kind of fear she had witnessed. "What did you just do?" Rachel's confusion was genuine and complete. She had touched his arm, nothing more. An accident of proximity and physics. She stammered this explanation, while her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough that her daughter responded with agitated movement. He demanded she do it again. Not a request, a command, delivered with intensity that suggested her continued employment and possibly her safety depended on immediate compliance. Rachel raised her hand slowly, terrified of whatever she had triggered, and placed her fingers against the same scarred forearm. His reaction was identical. Sharp intake of breath, eyes going wide with something between shock and wonder. He stared at the point of contact like he could see through skin to whatever impossible thing was happening beneath. Rachel tried to pull away. His grip tightened just enough to keep her hand in place. Then he was guiding her fingers to his other arm. Same response. His neck. Same impossible result. His face, where her palm pressed against his jaw, and he made a sound that might have been pain or relief, or something humanity didn't have proper vocabulary for. Other diners were starting to notice. Conversations dropped to whispers. People craned their necks to see what was happening in booth 7. Rachel's face burned with the attention, with the awareness that she was touching this man in ways that looked intimate and felt catastrophic. He released her wrist suddenly, leaving red marks where his fingers had gripped. His expression cycled through emotions too quickly for Rachel to track. Shock, confusion, something that looked dangerously close to need. He straightened his suit jacket with movements that took visible effort to control. His instructions came out clipped and absolute. Finish her shift. Complete all assigned duties. Then stay after closing. They needed to talk, and leaving before that conversation happened would be a mistake she wouldn't have opportunity to regret. Rachel nodded because what else could she do? She collected the dishes from booth 7 with hands that shook badly enough to make the plates rattle. She retreated to the kitchen while her mind raced through possibilities, each more frightening than the last. She was going to be fired. She was going to be hurt. She was going to disappear like people disappeared in stories about men who owned diners and controlled territories. Her daughter kicked again, a reminder that Rachel's choices affected more than just herself now. Whatever happened after closing, she would face it because she had no alternative. Women with nothing to lose made dangerous choices out of necessity, and Rachel had been operating on necessity since the moment that pregnancy test changed her entire trajectory. Comment your theory below, because what's about to happen will change both their lives forever. The Chrome Valley Diner emptied by 3 in the afternoon, the lull between lunch and dinner creating a pocket of quiet that felt unnatural after the chaos of service. The other staff clocked out for their break, grateful for 2 hours away from grease and demanding customers. Rachel received different instructions. Stay. Wait in booth 7. Don't leave. She sat across from Gabriel Stone with her hands folded on the table, trying to control the trembling that had started the moment the last server walked out the door. They were alone now, just a pregnant waitress, and the man who apparently owned this building, this block, possibly this entire district, based on the fear she had witnessed in everyone who spoke his name. Gabriel's methodical nature revealed itself in how he approached the impossible situation. He pressed his own fingers against the scar on his forearm, applying pressure that would have made normal people wince. His expression remained neutral, no reaction, no sensation beyond basic awareness of contact. Then he reached across the table and guided Rachel's hand to the same spot. The moment her fingertips made contact with raised tissue, his breath caught. His jaw clenched. His eyes closed briefly like someone experiencing something overwhelming that required full concentration to process. He released her hand and leaned back, studying her face with intensity that made Rachel want to disappear into the vinyl booth cushions. His next action made her stomach drop. He produced a folding knife from his jacket pocket, opened the blade with practiced efficiency, and before Rachel could process what was happening, drew the edge across his palm. Blood welled immediately, a clean slice that opened skin in a line that would require stitches. Gabriel stared at his bleeding palm with the same neutral expression he had worn while cutting himself, as if he had just opened an envelope rather than inflicting deliberate injury. Rachel's horror manifested in a strangled sound that might have been protest or disbelief. He was insane. She was trapped in a closed diner with someone who self-harmed for experimental purposes. Her daughter kicked frantically, responding to Rachel's spiking adrenaline. Gabriel extended his bleeding hand across the table, an offering and a command. Touch it. Rachel grabbed napkins instead, her maternal instincts overriding terror. He was bleeding. She needed to stop the bleeding. Basic human decency demanded action regardless of how disturbing the circumstances had become. She pressed the napkins against his palm, applying pressure that should have made him gasp. His gasp came from something else entirely. The moment her skin made contact with his open wound, sensation flooded through him with such intensity that his free hand gripped the table edge hard enough to leave impressions in the wood. His eyes went wide. His breathing accelerated into something that sounded like panic or ecstasy, or both competing for dominance. His voice came out rough, amazed, almost reverent. He could feel her hand. Not just pressure, but everything. The warmth of her palm, the texture of her skin, the subtle ridge of her fingerprints against his wound. Sensation his nervous system had never been designed to transmit, suddenly flowing through pathways that had been silent for 39 years. Rachel kept pressure on the bleeding while confusion warred with concern on her face. She didn't understand what was happening, couldn't comprehend why her touch triggered reactions that seemed to rewrite his entire physical experience. But she could see his genuine amazement, could hear the wonder in his voice that suggested she was witnessing something profound rather than dangerous. His questions came rapid fire once he regained capacity for organized thought. Was she taking medications? Did she have medical conditions? Allergies? Anything unusual about her health history? Rachel stammered answers while still holding pressure on his bleeding palm. Healthy pregnancy. No complications. Regular prenatal checkups showing normal development. No medications beyond standard prenatal vitamins. Nothing unusual, nothing special, nothing that explained why her touch accomplished something 40 medical specialists had declared impossible. Gabriel pulled his hand back, wrapping the napkins around his palm while blood soaked through white paper. He produced his phone with his uninjured hand and made a call that Rachel could only hear one side of. Dr. Brennan, his office. 2 hours. The tone made clear that negotiation wouldn't be entertained. He ended the call and turned his full attention back to Rachel. His next statement landed with the weight of absolute certainty. She was coming with him. His doctor needed to examine this phenomenon, and her presence was required for any meaningful testing. Rachel's refusal came out stronger than she expected. She couldn't leave the city, had work tomorrow, needed this job because rent was due and her daughter's arrival was imminent, and women in her position didn't have safety nets that allowed for mysterious medical appointments with dangerous men. Gabriel cut through her protests with a single sentence that made everything else irrelevant. She had just given him something he hadn't experienced in 39 years. Now he needed to understand why. And that understanding required her cooperation whether she wanted to provide it or not. Rachel met his eyes and saw something that terrified her more than threats or violence ever could. She saw need. Desperate, consuming need from someone who had probably never needed anything from anyone. And people who suddenly discovered they needed something tended to take it regardless of cost. Her daughter kicked again, harder this time, as if warning Rachel that the choice she made in the next 30 seconds would determine both their futures. Gabriel's office building occupied 12 floors of steel and glass in the financial district, legitimate businesses occupying the lower levels, while more sensitive operations ran from secure spaces above. Corporate lawyers worked on floor 3. Accounting firms handled paperwork on floors 5 through 7. Import-export companies that actually imported and exported maintained offices on floor 9. Everything appeared legal, taxed, documented with the kind of thoroughness that survived audits and regulatory scrutiny. The 15th floor didn't appear on the building directory. Access required a keycard that only 3 people possessed, and a fingerprint scanner that recorded every entry. Gabriel's hand pressed against the reader while Rachel stood beside him, her exhaustion now competing with anxiety that had evolved into something close to numbness. The elevator doors opened directly into a reception area that looked more like a luxury medical suite than a criminal office. Private examination rooms lined the hallway. Equipment that belonged in hospitals filled spaces behind doors marked with numbers instead of names. Rachel recognized some of the machinery from her prenatal appointments, but other devices looked specialized in ways that suggested purposes she didn't want to contemplate. Dr. Brennan arrived 18 minutes after Gabriel's call, his Mercedes still warm from the hurried drive across town. The neurologist was 63, impeccably dressed, carrying the kind of professional authority that came from decades of treating patients who could afford the best medical care money could legally and illegally purchase. His handshake was firm, his smile was practiced, his eyes showed the wariness of someone who understood that emergency summons from Gabriel Stone rarely involved good news. Gabriel explained the situation with clinical precision, describing the phenomenon without embellishment or emotion. Dr. Prague, Brennan's skepticism showed in the way his eyebrows rose incrementally higher with each detail. Respectful doubt, the kind doctors employed when patients reported symptoms that defied medical understanding. The demonstration changed his expression immediately. Rachel placed her hand on Gabriel's forearm while Dr. Brennan watched. Gabriel's reaction was instantaneous and undeniable. Sharp intake of breath, pupils dilating, heart rate increasing in ways the monitoring equipment captured with electronic precision. Scientific testing began with the methodical approach that separated genuine investigation from performance. Dr. Pei, Brennan attached sensors to Gabriel's body, electrodes that would measure nervous system responses in real time. Baseline readings confirmed what decades of previous testing had established. Gabriel's nerve pathways didn't transmit pain signals. The biological mechanism for suffering simply didn't function in his nervous system. Then Rachel touched his shoulder. The monitoring equipment registered immediate change. Neural activity spiked. Pain receptors that had been dormant for 39 years suddenly activated. Signals traveled from contact point through pathways that medical science had declared permanently non-functional. Dr. Brennan conducted the testing with increasingly frantic energy, Rachel's hand on Gabriel's chest, his back, his injured palm where the knife wound was already beginning to heal. Every location produced identical results. Where she touched, sensation flooded through him, pressure registered, temperature transmitted. Texture became something his brain could process and interpret. The sensory exploration revealed details that made Dr. Brennan's hands shake while taking notes. Gabriel could feel the slight calluses on Rachel's fingertips, evidence of manual labor that pregnancy hadn't eliminated. He could sense the warmth of her skin, degrees warmer than his own. He could detect the subtle texture differences between her palm and the back of her hand. Information that normal people took for granted became revelatory for someone experiencing it for the first time. Dr. Brennan shifted focus to Rachel, running tests that should have revealed some biological anomaly explaining her effect. Blood pressure normal for 8 months pregnant. Heart rate elevated but within acceptable range given stress and circumstances. Temperature standard. No unusual electromagnetic signature. No hormonal irregularities beyond what pregnancy naturally produced. She was, by every measurable metric, an ordinary woman carrying an ordinary child through an ordinary pregnancy. Nothing about her biochemistry suggested capability for neurological miracles. Tests on Gabriel showed his condition remained fundamentally unchanged. His nerve pathways still didn't function normally. Pain receptors still didn't fire in response to standard stimuli, except when Rachel touched him. In those moments, his nervous system functioned exactly as if he had been born completely normal. Dr. Brennan hypothesized desperately, grasping for explanations that might make sense of impossible data. Perhaps something in her biochemistry. Pregnancy hormones creating unique electromagnetic field that interacted with Gabriel's nervous system in unprecedented ways. Chemical compounds crossing between their skin that triggered dormant pathways. Quantum entanglement on biological level that science hadn't yet categorized. Gabriel cut through the speculation with a question that made the room temperature seem to drop. Or maybe Dr. Brennan had been lying about his condition for years. The neurologist went pale beneath the fluorescent examination lights. His throat worked as he tried to formulate response that wouldn't damn him. Gabriel leaned forward in the examination chair, sensors still attached to his body, blood-soaked napkins still wrapped around his palm. Multiple specialists had examined Gabriel throughout his life. Dozens of consultations, hundreds of tests. Universal consensus that his condition was congenital, permanent, completely untreatable. But Rachel had fixed it with her hand, which meant either every medical professional Gabriel had ever consulted was incompetent, or someone had been paying them to maintain his numbness for reasons Gabriel was only beginning to suspect. Dr. Brennan stammered that the condition had been real. Tests had been accurate. Results had matched textbook presentations of congenital insensitivity to pain. No deception, no conspiracy. Just medical fact documented across decades of examination. Gabrielle's voice dropped to the register that preceded violence in his world. Then why does her touch work? Dr. Ty. Brennan had no answer. Or more accurately, had an answer he was terrified to speak aloud. His eyes darted toward the examination room door, a nervous glance that suggested he was checking whether someone might overhear this conversation, someone who wouldn't appreciate questions being asked, someone who had reasons for wanting Gabriel's condition to remain untreated. Rachel watched this exchange from her chair in the corner, her hands protective over her belly, understanding that she had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a medical mystery. Doctor. Brennan excused himself to check old records, his footsteps quick and uneven as he left the examination room. The door clicked shut with finality that felt more like imprisonment than privacy. Rachel remained in her corner chair while Gabriel sat on the examination table, sensors still attached to his chest and arms, the monitoring equipment humming quietly in the background. The silence stretched between them, heavy with questions neither knew how to ask. Rachel finally broke it with the obvious inquiry that had been building since they left the diner. Why did Gabriel think Dr. Brennan was lying? Gabriel's laugh held no humor. In his business, everyone lied. The only relevant question was who benefited from the deception. Lies served purposes, protected interests, maintained power structures that would collapse under the weight of truth. Someone had profited from keeping Gabriel numb for 39 years, and he intended to discover who. Rachel absorbed this worldview, trying to reconcile it with her own experience where lies usually stemmed from weakness rather than strategy. Her voice came out smaller than she intended when she asked the question that had been terrorizing her since the testing began. What happened to her if Gabriel found out something bad? If this conspiracy reached into dark places that demanded dark responses? Gabriel turned his full attention to her, really seeing her for perhaps the first time since they had left the diner. 8 months pregnant, exhausted, terrified, completely innocent of whatever medical conspiracy had shaped his life. His answer came with certainty that surprised them both. She had nothing to do with this. Whatever he discovered, whatever consequences followed, she would remain untouched by the violence that might be required. The reassurance should have felt hollow coming from someone whose reputation was built on ruthlessness. Instead, Rachel heard genuine conviction in his voice, a promise he intended to keep regardless of what Dr. Brennan's files revealed. Gabriel surprised himself by asking about the baby. Simple question. Basic human curiosity. The kind of small talk he normally avoided because it suggested vulnerability he couldn't afford to display. But sitting in a medical examination room with monitoring equipment recording his impossible condition, normal social barriers felt less important than they had 6 hours earlier. Rachel's face softened when she answered. A girl, due in 3 weeks according to the most recent ultrasound, though babies followed their own schedules regardless of medical predictions. She had felt her daughter moving more in the past 2 months than she had felt anything else in her entire life. Constant reminder that survival had purpose beyond just continuing to breathe. He asked what name she had chosen. Rachel's expression shifted to something that looked like shame mixed with practical exhaustion. She hadn't picked one yet. Couldn't bring herself to think that far ahead when she was still focused on making rent, keeping employment, ensuring she had a safe place to give birth. Naming felt like luxury for women who had margin for planning beyond immediate survival. Gabriel opened his mouth to respond, though he had no idea what he intended to say. The examination room door opened before he could form words. Dr. Brennan returned, carrying a manila folder that looked decades old, papers yellowed at the edges, handwriting from an era before electronic medical records. His hand shook as he placed the folder on the examination table beside Gabriel. Multiple consultations documented from when Gabriel was 13, detailed notes about his condition, test results confirming congenital insensitivity to pain, follow-up appointments tracking his development. Everything appeared thorough, professional, exactly what medical records should contain. Gabriel read through the pages with methodical attention, looking for inconsistencies that might reveal deception. 3 pages in, he found notation that made his blood temperature drop to something approaching freezing. Treatment protocol abandoned per family request. Dated 15 years ago, when Gabriel had been 24 and already building his reputation through violence that his condition made possible. His voice came out dangerously quiet when he asked Dr. Brennan about the treatment protocol. What treatment? What had been abandoned? And why had family requests superseded medical recommendations? Dr. Brennan's confession came in broken segments, each word extracted like confession under torture. Experimental therapy had existed when Gabriel was a child. Nerve regeneration possibility through procedure that showed promise in limited trials. Not guaranteed, not without risks, but possible. His father had been informed of the option during Gabriel's initial diagnosis. The older Stone had refused treatment, explicitly, repeatedly, wanted his son to remain exactly as he was. Saw the condition as advantage rather than disability, believed Gabriel's inability to feel pain would make him unstoppable in ways that would benefit the family business. Multiple doctors had been paid to maintain the diagnosis without offering treatment options. Not just Dr. Rexiger, Brennan, though he had been the primary neurologist for the past decade. A whole network of medical professionals compensated for their silence, for documenting Gabriel's condition as permanent when treatment might have been possible, for ensuring that Gabriel remained numb while his father weaponized that numbness into empire. Gabriel's hands clenched, the monitoring equipment registering spike in muscle tension and heart rate. His voice barely rose above a whisper when he asked for confirmation. His father did this? Dr. Brennan nodded, sweat visible on his forehead despite the room's cool temperature. The older Stone had believed Gabriel's condition was his greatest weapon, training him to survive violence that killed normal men, pushing him into situations that built reputation impossible to achieve through conventional means. Gabriel's empire was constructed on foundation of deliberate medical neglect maintained through paid conspiracy. Rachel watched Gabriel process this information from her corner chair, seeing emotions war across his face in ways that probably no one else had witnessed. Rage competed with grief. Betrayal fought with understanding. The father who had shaped Gabriel's entire existence had done so by deliberately denying him treatment that might have let him live normally. His childhood had been calculated experiment. His adolescence had been strategic deployment. His adult life had been built on disability that could have been prevented, Every injury he had suffered without feeling, every infection that had spread unnoticed, every moment of isolation that came from knowing his body worked differently than everyone else's, all of it could have been avoided if his father had chosen treatment over weaponization. The monitoring equipment beeped steadily, recording Gabriel's vital signs while he absorbed the magnitude of his father's betrayal. Dr. Supposed, Brennan stood frozen near the door, waiting for a response that would determine whether he survived the afternoon. Rachel remained motionless in her chair, her hands protective over her belly, understanding that she was witnessing the moment when Gabriel's entire understanding of himself shattered and reformed into something new. If this revelation hit you hard, it hit him harder. This story gets deeper. Stay with me. Gabriel's command came out flat and absolute. Dr. Brennan would leave. Now. Take the files. Wait for further instructions. The neurologist fled the examination room like someone escaping execution temporarily postponed. The manila folder clutched against his chest, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until the elevator doors closed on his departure. Silence filled the medical suite. Gabriel sat on the examination table, sensors still monitoring his vital signs. Though the readings had become irrelevant compared to what the files had revealed, Rachel remained in her corner chair watching him process information that had rewritten his entire history in the span of 20 minutes. She didn't know what to say. Condolences felt inadequate. Questions seemed intrusive. So she waited, giving him space to work through whatever emotions were currently destroying and rebuilding his understanding of himself. Gabriel finally spoke, his voice carrying exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. His father had died 6 years ago. Heart attack during a business dinner, sudden and complete. Never told Gabriel the truth about the treatment option. Never confessed to the paid conspiracy that had maintained his son's disability for profit and power. Took the secret to his grave like it was just another business decision that didn't warrant discussion. The empire Gabriel controlled had been built on false premise that he couldn't be hurt. Every negotiation conducted from position of fearlessness. Every conflict resolved through his willingness to absorb damage that made other men retreat. Every piece of territory claimed because his reputation preceded him like armor that couldn't be penetrated. All of it constructed on disability that his father had deliberately maintained. Every fight he had survived could have been prevented. Every injury he had endured without proper treatment stemmed from condition that treatment might have corrected. Gabriel looked at his scarred hands, mapping decades of damage across skin that told stories of violence his body had never properly warned him against. His voice came out rough with emotion he rarely permitted himself to acknowledge. He had lost feeling in 3 fingers to infection. He didn't notice until the tissue had rotted beyond saving. Walked on broken ankle for 2 weeks because pain never arrived to signal that something was catastrophically wrong. Nearly bled out from internal injuries he couldn't detect until he collapsed from blood loss during a meeting. His voice cracked on the next words, vulnerability breaking through control that usually defined him. His father had let him suffer so he could be useful, weaponized his son's disability into tool for building criminal empire. Every moment of isolation, every injury, every consequence of living without pain had been preventable. His father had chosen power over his son's well-being, and that choice had shaped Gabriel's entire existence. Rachel reached across the space between examination table and chair, her movement instinctive rather than calculated. She took his hand, her fingers wrapping around his scarred palm with gentle pressure that somehow conveyed more than words ever could. The sensation flooded through Gabriel again, but different this time. Not just the shock of feeling where numbness had always existed. This was warmth, pressure, human connection that his nervous system suddenly understood on levels beyond basic sensory input. Her touch carried comfort, understanding, shared recognition of betrayal that neither of them had chosen but both had to survive. He stared at their joined hands like he was witnessing miracle he still couldn't fully comprehend. Why her? Of all the people he had encountered throughout 39 years, why could this pregnant waitress accomplish what medical science declared impossible? Rachel's answer came quietly, honestly, without pretense of understanding she didn't possess. She didn't know. But maybe this phenomenon had less to do with her specifically, and more to do with Gabriel being ready to feel something, ready to experience connection his father had stolen, ready to acknowledge that numbness was prison rather than advantage. Gabriel confessed something he had never told anyone, the loneliness of his condition. Never feeling another person's touch as anything beyond pressure and temperature. Never experiencing the comfort of human contact the way normal people did. Spending his entire life isolated inside body that couldn't communicate experiences everyone else took for granted. Building walls around himself because vulnerability meant weakness and weakness meant death in his world. Rachel shared her own isolation in return. Family rejection when she refused their ultimatum. abandonment by the man who had promised forever, until forever required responsibility. Facing motherhood alone in city where she knew no one, working jobs that paid barely enough to survive, preparing to bring daughter into world that felt hostile on good days and catastrophic on bad ones. Unexpected parallel emerged between them, both pushed into survival mode by circumstances beyond their control, both shaped by betrayals from people who should have protected them, both learning that strength sometimes meant enduring what couldn't be changed, while refusing to let it destroy you completely. Gabriel made his decision with the certainty that had built his empire. He would find every doctor his father had paid off, track down everyone who had participated in the conspiracy, ensure they understood that their silence had cost him 39 years of normal existence. Rachel's worry manifested in quiet question. What would he do to them? Gabriel didn't answer directly. His response carried implications rather than specifics. They had stolen his chance at normal life, participated in betrayal that shaped his entire trajectory. That required consequences proportional to damage inflicted. What form those consequences took would depend on what else he discovered about who knew what and when they had known it. Late afternoon sun slanted through the medical suite windows, casting long shadows across examination equipment that had revealed truths Gabriel wasn't sure he wanted to possess. He disconnected the monitoring sensors from his chest, removing evidence of the testing that had confirmed both miracle and conspiracy. His movements were methodical, controlled, the kind of deliberate calm that preceded calculated action. He insisted on driving Rachel home. Not a suggestion, a requirement. She needed to get somewhere safe, and he needed to ensure that somewhere actually qualified as safe given what they had discovered about her unique effect on his nervous system. Rachel's reluctance showed in how she clutched her bag against her pregnant belly, creating barrier between herself and his insistence. She didn't want him seeing where she lived, didn't want him understanding exactly how desperate her circumstances had become. Pride existed even in poverty, maybe especially in poverty. Gabriel's response carried weight that made refusal impossible. She was carrying something valuable now. His conscience, which had been dormant for years. His connection to feeling, which had been stolen since birth. That made her safety his responsibility whether she appreciated his intervention or not. His car was exactly what Rachel expected. Black. Expensive. Windows tinted dark enough to obscure occupants while maintaining perfect visibility from inside. The leather seats probably cost more than 3 months of her rent. She sank into passenger seat that adjusted automatically to accommodate her pregnancy, technology responding to her body in ways that felt invasive and comforting simultaneously. The drive through city streets gave Gabriel opportunity to ask questions he probably had no right to ask but would ask anyway. Why this city specifically? Why alone? What circumstances had brought a pregnant woman to a place where she clearly had no support system? Rachel's explanation came haltingly, each detail extracted like confession she had been avoiding since arriving 2 months ago. Her former boyfriend had seemed perfect until the pregnancy test changed his entire personality. He had demanded termination. She refused. His response had escalated from verbal pressure to physical violence that put her in the emergency room with bruised ribs and split lip that required 4 stitches. She ran, packed what fit in 2 suitcases while he was at work, bought bus ticket to city she had never visited, chosen because it was far enough from home that accidental encounters became statistically impossible. Her family had disowned her the moment she chose to keep the baby over their approval, so running meant leaving nothing behind that actually mattered. Gabriel's question came after long silence that suggested he was processing information through lens of his own experience with betrayal. Was her ex still looking for her? Rachel's answer held uncertainty that had kept her awake through countless nights in her room above the laundromat. She didn't know. Hoped he had moved on, prayed he had found someone else to control and forgotten about the woman who had escaped his reach. But hope wasn't certainty, and prayer wasn't protection. They arrived at her building 20 minutes later. Rundown didn't adequately describe the structure. The laundromat occupied the ground floor, its fluorescent lights visible through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. External stairs led to second floor where Rachel rented space that technically qualified as housing, only because the landlord didn't ask questions and the building inspector apparently accepted bribes. Gabrielle walked her upstairs despite her protests. His presence felt enormous in the narrow stairwell, filling space that barely accommodated one person comfortably. Rachel's door required 3 attempts to unlock, the mechanism sticking in ways that suggested maintenance had never been building priority. Her studio space was exactly what a room costing $400 monthly should be. Twin mattress on the floor, second-hand baby items stacked in corner awaiting an arrival that was coming whether Rachel felt prepared or not. Small refrigerator that hummed loudly enough to interrupt sleep. Stack of job applications on makeshift desk constructed from cardboard boxes and plywood. Rationed food organized with precision that spoke of someone who counted every calorie, every dollar, every resource that stood between survival and catastrophe. Gabriel absorbed this reality in silence, seeing what her life actually looked like stripped of pretense or protection. Real survival, the kind that required daily calculation about whether to buy food or pay utilities, the kind that meant working while 8 months pregnant because stopping meant homelessness, the kind his money had insulated him from so thoroughly that he had forgotten it existed. Something shifted in his perception of her. Recognition of strength that looked nothing like the power he wielded but might actually be more impressive. She was building life from nothing, carrying child she would raise alone, surviving in a city that offered no safety net for women in her circumstances. He produced his phone and made call while standing in her tiny room, not asking permission because he had already decided. He needed security detail, 2 people, starting immediately. The arrangements would be handled through channels that required no further discussion. Rachel's protest came swift and desperate. She couldn't afford protection, didn't need bodyguards. Her anonymity was her safety, and having armed men following her would destroy the invisibility she had worked so hard to maintain. Gabriel cut through her objections with reality she needed to understand. She could feel his pain. That made her valuable in ways that transcended her own understanding of the situation. Valuable things got protected whether they wanted it or not. His world operated on different rules than the ones she was accustomed to following. Darker edge entered his voice as he explained the full scope of her danger. If his enemies discovered what she could do, they would use her to hurt him. Kidnap her, torture her, use her unique ability as weapon against the one person who couldn't feel consequences of violence. Her daughter became leverage the moment Gabriel's connection to Rachel became known. Rachel's face went pale as understanding crystallized. She had stumbled into something that put both her and her baby at risk simply by touching his arm during lunch service. The complication hit without warning. Rachel doubled over, gripping her stomach with both hands, face contorting with pain that made Gabriel's protective instincts override his usual calculating distance. He reached for her immediately, his hands steadying her shoulders, and he felt it, the tension in her body, the rigid muscles fighting against something happening inside her that her body wasn't ready to handle. Rachel gasped out explanation between laboured breaths, Braxton Hicks contractions. Practice labour happened sometimes in late pregnancy. She would be fine, just needed to breathe through it. But she clearly wasn't fine. Her breathing came in sharp gasps that suggested pain beyond normal practice contractions. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her hands clutched her belly with desperation that made Gabriel's newly awakened nerves scream with sympathetic response. He was completely out of his depth. Called Dr. Farversus. Brennan, despite the earlier tension because medical emergency superseded personal grievances, and that's when her water broke, 8 weeks early, in the tiny room above a laundromat. Chaos erupted in the tiny room above the laundromat. Gabriel grabbed his phone, barking orders at emergency dispatch, while Rachel gripped the edge of her mattress, fluid soaking through cheap sheets onto the floor below.
8 weeks early.
Too soon. Her daughter wasn't supposed to arrive like this, in a studio apartment with no medical equipment and a man she had met 6 hours ago. The ambulance arrived within 7 minutes, paramedics navigating narrow stairs with equipment that barely fit through doorways designed for single occupancy. They assessed Rachel with professional efficiency, asking questions about her due date, her prenatal care, whether she had experienced any complications during the pregnancy. Rachel answered between contractions that were coming faster now, her body initiating process that couldn't be reversed or delayed. Gabriel rode in the ambulance, his presence filling the confined space with authority that made the paramedics nervous despite their training. He held Rachel's hand because she had grabbed it during a contraction and hadn't let go, her grip tightening with each wave of pain that her body transmitted through premature labor. He felt everything, every muscle contraction, every tremor, every spike of pain that made her breathing hitch and her fingers dig into his palm. For the first time in his life, Gabriel experienced someone else's suffering through direct physical contact, and the sensation overwhelmed him in ways that bullets and knife wounds never had. The hospital admitted Rachel through emergency entrance at 2 in the afternoon, sun still high in sky that seemed oblivious to the crisis unfolding inside sterile corridors. Doctors descended with urgency that confirmed what Rachel already knew: premature labor at 32 weeks, baby in distress. Preparation for delivery that was happening whether medical staff felt ready or not. Gabriel stayed close, violating every protocol about who belonged in delivery rooms during medical emergencies. He used his influence the way he always did, making phone calls that ensured cooperation from hospital administrators who suddenly discovered that rules could be flexible when properly motivated. No one told him to leave after that. Labor progressed with terrifying speed. Rachel's body had made its decision, and medicine could only manage complications rather than stop the inevitable. Contractions came 90 seconds apart. Her cervix dilated faster than doctors expected. The baby was coming whether anyone felt prepared for premature arrival. Rachel was terrified in ways that made her earlier fears about employment and housing seem trivial by comparison. Too early, baby too small, lungs probably underdeveloped. Survival rates at 32 weeks were better than earlier gestations, but complications remained abundant. Her daughter might not survive the afternoon. Gabriel held her hand through each contraction, feeling her pain transmit through their joined skin into his nervous system that had finally learned how to process suffering. She squeezed hard enough to leave bruises that he would actually feel forming. He didn't let go. Doctors worked with organized chaos that revealed years of training crystallized into decisive action. Fetal monitoring showed baby in distress, heart rate dropping with each contraction, decision made quickly. Emergency cesarean necessary. The baby couldn't withstand prolonged labor, and waiting meant risking outcomes no one wanted to contemplate. Rachel cried as they prepped her for surgery, begging medical staff to save her daughter, promising she would do anything, pay anything, sacrifice anything if they could just keep her baby alive. Gabriel watched this woman who had nothing offer everything to save the child she hadn't even met yet. He made promise he had no business making, his voice cutting through her panic with certainty he didn't actually possess. Her daughter would be fine, he would make sure of it. Whatever resources, whatever specialists, whatever intervention was required, would be provided without question or hesitation. Gabriel used his connections while surgical team assembled, phone calls to contacts who owed him favors. The best neonatal surgeon in the city received summons that interrupted his afternoon, but came with compensation that made objections impossible. Money moved, transportation arranged, expertise purchased and deployed with efficiency that only unlimited resources could provide. Surgery began at 3:15. Gabrielle was forced to wait outside, pacing hospital corridors while doctors worked to deliver a baby, 8 weeks before her scheduled arrival. 3 hours of helpless waiting, 3 hours of feeling utterly useless despite all the power he commanded in other contexts. 3 hours of understanding that some situations couldn't be resolved through intimidation or strategic violence. He realized during that endless afternoon that he cared about Rachel in ways that transcended what she could do for him. Not because her touch restored sensation he had never experienced, not because she represented medical miracle that rewrote his understanding of his own body. He cared because she was brave and desperate and fighting for her daughter with determination that reminded him what strength actually looked like. The baby arrived at 6:07, 3 pounds 2 ounces. Tiny human fighting for every breath through lungs that hadn't finished developing. She was rushed immediately to the neonatal intensive care unit, surrounded by specialists who worked with precision, born from saving infants who arrived too early into a world that wasn't ready for them. Rachel remained unconscious from anesthesia, her body recovering from surgery while her daughter fought separate battle in different room. She hadn't seen her child yet, hadn't held her, hadn't confirmed with her own eyes that the baby she had carried for 8 months had survived delivery. Gabrielle stood at the NICU window watching through glass that separated him from the tiny infant covered in tubes and wires and medical equipment that looked enormous compared to her fragile body. Machines breathed for her. Monitors tracked vital signs that determined whether she would survive the next hour. Nurses adjusted settings with careful expertise that suggested they had done this countless times but never treated it as routine. The neonatal surgeon approached Gabriel shortly before 7, still wearing surgical scrubs, exhaustion evident in how he carried himself. The next 72 hours would be critical. The baby was fighter, strong vital signs considering her gestational age, but premature birth carried risks that couldn't be eliminated through even the best medical intervention. Gabriel thought about his father keeping him in pain because it served strategic purpose, thought about Rachel fighting alone because everyone who should have protected her had chosen themselves instead, thought about cycles of betrayal that continued because no one decided to break them. He made a decision that surprised himself, standing in hospital corridor while sun finally began setting beyond windows he barely noticed. Whatever happened next, Rachel and her daughter wouldn't face it alone. Whatever resources they needed would be provided. Whatever protection required would be deployed. Whatever future they built would include stability that Rachel had been denied by everyone else in her life. When Rachel woke hours into evening, disoriented and panicked, Gabriel was beside her hospital bed. He took her hand, felt her pulse racing with fear that made his own heart respond through sympathetic connection. He told her what she needed to hear. Her daughter was alive. Breathing on her own now, though machines provided support. 3 pounds, 2 ounces of stubborn determination that had already survived what many babies didn't. Rachel cried with relief that seemed to pour out of her in waves, tears soaking hospital pillow, while Gabriel held her hand and let her feel everything she needed to feel. She asked to see her daughter with desperation that made hospital policy seem irrelevant. Gabriel arranged it, using influence to acquire a wheelchair and escort through corridors to the NICU. Rachel saw her daughter for the first time through plastic incubator that maintained temperature and humidity that womb should have provided for 8 more weeks. She named her right there, voice breaking on the single word that carried weight of everything Rachel had survived to reach this moment: hope. Because that's what her daughter represented. Hope that survival was possible. Hope that better futures could be built from desperate circumstances. Hope that love could exist in places where it seemed impossible to take root. Gabriel watched this woman who had nothing find everything in 3 pound miracle that might not survive the week but had already changed both their lives forever. 3 weeks later, afternoon sunlight filtered through NICU windows in ways that made the medical equipment look less threatening than it had on that first terrifying day. Baby Hope had stabilized, gaining weight with stubborn determination that suggested she had inherited her mother's refusal to surrender. Her prognosis improved daily, doctors growing cautiously optimistic about outcomes that had seemed uncertain during those initial 72 hours. Rachel stayed in hospital housing designed for NICU parents, a small room 2 floors below where her daughter fought to grow strong enough for discharge. The space was institutional but clean, providing proximity that let her visit during every feeding time, every assessment, every moment when Hope needed her mother's presence even if she was too young to fully comprehend it. Gabriel visited every afternoon, arriving during hours when the NICU allowed parents to hold their infants for brief periods that felt simultaneously too short and impossibly precious. He brought necessities Rachel needed but wouldn't ask for, clothes that fit properly, food with actual nutritional value, small comforts that transformed survival into something approaching living. He covered all hospital bills without discussing it, payments processed through accounts that ensured Rachel never saw invoices that would have crushed her under debt she couldn't possibly repay. Money that meant little to him purchased peace of mind that meant everything to her. His investigation had concluded during those 3 weeks. 6 doctors identified as participants in his father's conspiracy. Each one dealt with according to methods Gabriel employed when betrayal demanded consequences. He implied outcomes without providing details Rachel probably didn't want to possess. Justice or revenge, depending on perspective. Resolution either way. But revenge felt hollow compared to sitting beside someone who actually needed him for reasons beyond fear or obligation. Rachel needed support. Hope needed protection. That purpose felt more meaningful than any territory he controlled or any enemy he had defeated. Rachel asked during one afternoon visit why he kept coming. She understood the hospital bills, could accept his guilt about putting her in danger. But daily visits suggested investment beyond responsibility. Her voice carried confusion when she stated what seemed obvious to her. He didn't owe her anything. Gabriel's honesty surprised them both. She had given him ability to feel. Now he was learning what that meant. Learning that sensation included more than physical touch. Learning that connection required vulnerability he had spent decades avoiding. He confessed truths he had never articulated even to himself. He used to believe emotion was weakness. Pain was irrelevant detail that other people let control their decisions. Feeling was liability that made men hesitate when action was required. His father had taught these lessons through deliberate medical neglect and strategic deployment of Gabriel's condition. Now Gabriel understood differently. Pain was information that prevented damage. Feeling was connection that made life worth surviving. Vulnerability was strength that let people build relationships beyond transactions and fear. Rachel touched his hand across the small space between their chairs. He felt it, still marveled. 3 weeks later, that her touch continued to transmit sensation his nervous system had been designed to reject. Her voice came quietly when she admitted her own transformation. She had been surviving, calculating each day as equation where success meant reaching the next morning. He made her want to live, want to build future beyond immediate crisis, want to believe that better circumstances were possible rather than just theoretical. The nurse brought Hope out during afternoon feeding time, the tiny infant swaddled in blankets that made her look even smaller than her current 4 pounds suggested. Gabriel helped Rachel hold their daughter, his hands supporting the weight that Rachel's recovering body struggled to manage alone. Hope's tiny hand wrapped around Gabriel's finger during the feeding, grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. Sensation flooded through him in ways that had nothing to do with restored nerve function and everything to do with connection he hadn't known he was capable of experiencing. This was what feeling actually meant. Not just physical touch, but emotional response that made him understand why people built families and protected them against impossible odds. Rachel watched his face, seeing wonder replace the calculated control that usually defined his expression. She asked if he could feel hope, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear him say it. Gabriel nodded, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what 3 weeks had revealed about himself. Everything. He felt everything. The warmth of Hope's tiny body, the rhythm of her breathing, the trust implicit in how she relaxed against his hand, like she already understood he would keep her safe. He realized his father's greatest crime had nothing to do with pain. Keeping Gabriel numb had prevented him from feeling this. Human connection, genuine care, love he didn't know existed inside himself because he had never been allowed to experience the physical sensations that accompanied emotional attachment. Gabriel made his offer while Hope slept between them, her tiny chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance that would eventually become unnecessary. When Hope was released, Gabriel had a house, empty rooms that could become nursery, security that would ensure safety Rachel couldn't provide alone, resources that would let her focus entirely on her daughter without calculating whether she could afford rent or food or basic necessities. Rachel hesitated, her independence warring with practical reality. Accepting felt like too much. Becoming dependent on him created vulnerability that terrified her after spending months learning to rely only on herself. Gabriel's insistence carried conviction rather than pressure. He had spent 39 years feeling nothing. She changed that. Let him do this. Let him learn what it meant to feel family, to protect people who mattered, to build something beyond empire and fear. Rachel agreed through tears that represented relief and gratitude and hope that circumstances might actually improve rather than just continuing to challenge her survival at every turn. Final scene played out in afternoon light that made the NICU feel less like medical facility and more like sanctuary where miracles happened daily. Gabriel held Hope while she slept against his chest, feeling her breathing, her warmth, her tiny heartbeat that proved she was a fighter who refused to surrender despite arriving 8 weeks before the world was ready for her. Gabriel understood finally. The most dangerous man in the territory became dangerous because he couldn't feel consequences. Violence was strategy rather than last resort. Pain was theoretical rather than experiential reality. His father had weaponized that disconnection into empire. Now Gabriel could feel everything. Every sensation, every emotion, every consequence that made him human rather than just effective. And the first thing he chose to feel was family. Not biological obligation, but chosen connection with woman and child who needed him for reasons beyond fear. That's how a man born without pain learned that feeling everything was the greatest gift he never knew he needed. If this story moved you, I'd be grateful if you shared your thoughts in the comments, and I would really appreciate it if you could share your thoughts about my videos. Your feedback helps me improve and create even better content for you. Thank you for being here.